Good afternoon and welcome to our special International Women's Day event. I'm Philippa Thomas, a global broadcaster until very recently, a BBC chief news presenter and your chair for the next hour as we ask how we can break the bias and help create digital freedom around the world. At a time when we live online as much as off, at a time of global instability, even chaos, it does feel more important than ever to talk about how together we build a better, fairer world. What do we mean by break the bias? Well, it's the call to action for this year's International Women's Day. And there are 5 themes which urge all of us to imagine a gender-equal world. A world free of bias, stereotypes and discrimination. A world that is diverse, equitable and inclusive. A world where difference is valued and celebrated so that together we can help to forge women's equality. Big ambitions. What do these themes mean to us and what part can we play? Well, in a few minutes, I'll be calling on the expertise of 5 very impressive women, our panel from Avast Foundation, the Oxford Internet Institute, the BBC and the UN. I'll be asking each to give their take on one of these 5 themes before we join a group conversation and bring in your questions and observations. But first, I want to take a moment to talk to our hosts here today for this International Women's Day event. Vita Transutek, Chief Product Officer at Avast and Executive Sponsor of Women at Avast, the company's employee resource group. And Chris Stein, who is Head of Grants and Insights at Avast Foundation, the philanthropic arm of the corporation. First, I want to talk to Vita. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your time today. And I want to ask you first, because you're the sponsor of the Women at Avast group, how important is it for organisations to be able to create these formal groupings to provide this voice?
Hello, and thanks for having me. So a couple of years ago in Avast, we thought about the way that we're building products and the way that we're talking to our users and to our customers. And we have come to realize that maybe some of the activities that we're doing and the strategy that we have may be biased by the limited diversity we had in the leadership team and the company as a whole. We felt that without a proper representation of women inside of the company, we may not be talking to our customers in the way that they want to be talked to, and we didn't understand well enough. We started thinking about how do we make this better, and we started implementing internally and with the help of third parties programs targeting women on all levels in their career to help them get into tech on one side and then becoming successful on all the levels, all the way to the executive team. We have come a long way since then, and if there should be one message that I like to give to all the other organizations and companies, it is that it is a journey. It is not a problem that can be easily understood, and I can tell you from my own experience that many of the problems that we have seen are totally non-obvious, and let alone finding the proper solutions. The role of the companies and organizations in society has changed significantly over the past couple of years, and I believe strongly that the companies should be leading the way and influencing society to enable women and minorities to have their voice.
Sounds, Vita, as if you have made a change and you're hearing different things now. What sort of issues or what sort of contribution emerges, do you think, that might go missing from the corporate conversation without a group like this, without encouraging women to speak out?
So if you don't mind, I'll split it into 2 parts. Like the first one is that, as I mentioned previously, that without giving women or minorities, for that matter, a voice, it is very hard for the companies to even understand what a problem is, what are the obstacles that they may be seeing, and what solutions or what help would let them succeed in a company. And then more on the outcome side, we have seen positive impact on the business by us being able to tailor products better for women, by women coming to us or coming to the product teams with concrete ideas on how to make the products more useful or more appealing to the women's base. On the operations side, we see that the dynamics of the teams have improved significantly in this more natural environment, that the communication is much more cultivated and effective, and then thus the productivity of the team is much higher than it was before. We're also looking at as a team, we're looking at problems in different ways, and we're finding different solutions that we'll be able to find otherwise.
Vita Santrucek, thank you so much for joining us. And we're going to move on now to Chris Stein, who is Head of Grants and Insight at Avast Foundation. Chris, for those who don't know, what would you describe as the driving vision of the foundation?
Well, firstly, good afternoon, and it's a real honor to be here representing the Avast Foundation. Also, as a father of two young girls, the topic of gender equality is really core to me. But to go back to your question, Philippa, the foundation's vision is, I'm just going to make a direct quote of it so that's very clear, an equitable and inclusive digital future in which everyone has safe access to the tools and opportunities they need to reach their full potential. And to achieve that vision, the mission is to work globally with communities, NGOs, charities, educational institutions, governments, and policymakers to tackle issues of digital exclusion, remove barriers to digital access, and champion digital citizenship. So what does this show us? It shows us the centrality of people and communities, but that in order to support individuals and communities, that the foundation must engage stakeholders across a range of sectors and in a number of ways, but also always maintaining the value of hearing and of the voice of those communities, and that doing so is central to the concept of partnership and working towards reaching that full potential.
And Chris, we're talking today about Break the Bias, with these 5 themes for trying to enhance digital freedom. What spoke to you most? What resonates for you?
Well, there are many ways in which the themes of International Women's Day and the foundation, they cross over and they intersect quite clearly. But from a personal perspective, I suppose I wanted to just expand on a couple of themes. The first being a world that is diverse, equitable, and inclusive. And the second being a world where difference is valued and celebrated. When talking about the world, it is by nature diverse, but it's not always been equitable and as inclusive as it either could or should be. Too often, other dynamics such as power blur the lines in working towards these end goals. So giving space to multiple and diverse ranges of voices builds equity and is inclusive in practice. Of course, practicing inclusion is one step, but valuing difference and celebrating it means going beyond a practice and hearing multiple voices to listening to and valuing what those voices say. Celebrating difference models a world to future generations that empowers those who may feel like they don't have a voice otherwise. And again, going back to my role as a father of two young girls, I would not just hope for, but also work towards a future where their voices are valued and celebrated, that their perspectives are heard and considered, and that they and their peers can go on and model the values of an equitable society that is inclusive to future generations after them.
Chris, and before you, Vita, thank you both so much for hosting this event and providing us with this curtain raiser for the panel discussion we're going to have now with experts from across the world about the theme of this year's International Women's Day. We're going to be talking about the Break the Bias themes, from what a gender equal world will mean to a focus on what diversity and inclusion actually requires of us all. So here's our panel. Welcome to them. I'm going to spend a few minutes with each of our experts before bringing them together for a group conversation. We would like your questions and comments. Do send them in as we go, and we'll try to get them to our panel. Let's start now. I want to speak to Danola Oladapo, Chair of the Avast Foundation Youth Leadership Board. Danola also works in the digital inclusion team at the ITO. That's the United Nations Agency for Information Communications Technology. She's very much on top of this. Danola, we're being asked to imagine a gender equal world. Obviously not there yet, but your thoughts as to what matters most. Where should we start to focus?
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm very grateful to be here. Yes, gender equal world is, by definition, a better world for everyone, because it means everyone would at least have, more equal access to economic and social power and resources, regardless of their gender. And this is a world that we should all be striving for. We live in a world where gender inequality rears itself in a multiplicity of forms, and we have to combat it at every level, from wage inequality to FGM practices to unequal access to education for girls in certain parts of the world, to all forms of conscious and unconscious bias women, face globally. The challenges are really complex, as was said earlier, especially when you start to take into consideration cultural context and practices. So step one in tackling this will always be the acknowledgement, trying to really understand the issue and then creating awareness. And that's why conversations like the one we're having right now are just so important.
About digital inclusion, it matters. It's a really important goal. But how do you start? How do you reach people who are off the radar, who don't have the access that many of us just take for granted?
Yeah, no, according to the latest ITU data, 2.9 billion people do not have regular access to the internet. So that's 2.9 billion people who couldn't even be part of this gender equality conversation that we're having right now, even if they wanted to. In 2020, only 57% of women across the world were online compared to 62% of men online worldwide. So the gender digital divide is very real. To be able to provide access to the most marginalized groups across the world, we need a multi-stakeholder approach. The international organizations, the public sectors, private sector, foundations, academic institutions, individuals, we all really need to work together to really push the dial on this issue.
And of course, with your role on the Youth Leadership Board, you're probably hearing things, you're probably hearing demands about what those who are older, those of us who are older, need to know. The assumptions there might be among those who are in their 40s and above. What kind of impatience do you hear? What kind of demands are you hearing?
I think, the fact that gender inequality and it's such an issue that we're even discussing right now means that we're going in the right direction. But I'm a young woman myself, and I, for myself and for future generations, want a more equal world. I'm also a Black woman, so there's the sort of intersectionality that comes with. And just in my role on the YLB, as well as my role in the ITU, I see every day the fact that everyone is not on an equal playing field, especially when it comes to issues of access to connectivity. This is something that we all need to have top of mind, because if we have any level of privilege to even be able to be online to have this conversation, I think it's a responsibility for us to think of how others who don't have the same access could also gain that access as soon as possible.
Danola, brilliant to hear from you, and do stay with us. We'll come back to you in our group discussion. We've been talking just now about those who don't have access. What about those who have access but abuse it? I want next to talk to Mariana Spring, who is the specialist disinformation and social media reporter at the BBC. I've worked with her many times. I know that she puts herself in the line of fire, and that, Mariana, you get a lot of abuse for the investigations that you do. And I just want to mention one of them, your recent BBC Panorama programme called Online Abuse, Why Do You Hate Me? Mariana, let's look at another of these themes for Break the Bias, which is a world free of bias, stereotypes and discrimination. Your thoughts on that?
All of the women I interviewed for the Panorama investigation that you mentioned raised these topics and spoke about the impact that threats, death threats, rape threats, gendered slurs that they've been receiving online for doing their jobs, for being politicians, for being influencers, or just for being doctors and teachers, how that had affected them. And when we talk about the effect of online abuse, we often have this discussion about freedom of speech. And I spend a lot of time holding responsible with my reporting the social media sites for the approach that they take to abuse, threats, and disinformation more broadly. And all of the women I spoke to for Panorama explained how their freedom of speech is absolutely limited by hate and threats that they receive. It deters them from doing their jobs. It puts them off continuing doing their jobs. It stops them being able to work. It leaves them feeling frightened. And it's not just about being a woman. A number of these women received abuse, racist abuse, homophobic abuse, abuse that was a whole range of different protected characteristics about them that left them just feeling incredibly distraught. And I, as you say, I myself have experienced a lot of hate online for the reporting I do, often taking the form of death and rape threats, but everything from gendered slurs to silly little girl and trying to undermine the work I do. And I'm really lucky to have brilliant support at the BBC. So many of these women I interviewed don't have that. They don't have people that understand what's happening to them. They don't feel protected on their social media platforms. And like I say, they feel unable to speak out. So it's absolutely so important to them that they feel as though we're talking about this and they're heard, and that we understand the impact this can have, not just on them, but on all of us and on our society.
Yeah, when you say that, Mariana, it makes me think that break the bias is the slogan, the phrase that we're using for this International Women's Day event. But being able to talk about break the bias and what it means and what you might be free of if you break the bias matters to those who are at the sharp end.
It does, and I think particularly when it comes to online hate, which women are disproportionately affected by relative to men, and then women who also experience racist and homophobic hate are even more affected by. There's been this stigma about talking about it, that talking about it somehow makes us weak or vulnerable, again kind of playing into tropes about women in general. And that actually I've found it very empowering to be able to report on and investigate this topic and reveal the impact it's having on people, but also to hold accountable all of the institutions and companies that have responsibility here. And as part of the Panorama investigation, we set up an experiment. It was an account called Barry. Barry was based on accounts that have sent me hate. Barry was generally into conspiracy theories, but also some anti-women content on social media. And over the course of 2 weeks, particularly on Facebook and Instagram, he was promoted more and more anti-women hate, including jokes about rape, jokes about harassment, and content from the incel community. Facebook and Instagram told us, Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, told us that they do put the well-being of their users and female users, that's a priority. They put it over profit. But as this experiment revealed, there's clearly a huge problem online. And if we don't reveal it and we don't speak up about it, people just aren't aware of it, and it continues. And off the back of that investigation, I testified to MPs about the Barry the Troll experiment. We saw how that was then reflected in some of the online safety drafts and draft legislation here in the UK. And I think it's so crucial that we speak up on these issues and aren't afraid to, as journalists, report on them, and as people to speak up if we can, because it clearly does make a difference.
Yeah, I want to be able to speak about solutions as well as challenges. And Mariana, although you're dealing with a lot that's negative, is there anything you can tell us about those who've stepped up? What gives you hope?
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the most important moments of my career so far was the impact that Panorama investigation had, and how many of the women who I interviewed reached out to me, but also women from across the world, explaining how they felt so relieved that someone was revealing and exposing what they've been experiencing, that they hoped that it would expose the scale of the problem. And as we've seen in the reaction from both social media sites and politicians here in the UK, but all over the world to that investigation, there absolutely is a willingness to resolve these problems. And I think my job is to investigate and reveal them, and often as a consequence, hopefully that happens. And I think that even over the course of the past 2 years doing my job, a lot of the hate I experience is for covering online conspiracies. But actually, I think that the attitude towards online hate and the saying this actually isn't okay and we don't need to put up with it has changed, and I feel very well supported, and like people understand why it matters and why it's a problem, and it feels like a relief, really similar to those women who get in touch with me, to be able to say, oh wow, it really isn't normal to constantly be called these gendered slurs, and people constantly target me for being a woman online, and so here's what we can do next.
Mariana, it is really good to hear that, and I love the way in which, of course, you're all listening to each other. And for those who are with us online, I'd say do send in your questions and comments, and we'll try to get to them, or at least to some of them, as we wrap up this debate. But I want to move on now to Erin Gallegos, who is the Head of Partnerships and Programme Delivery at the Avast Foundation. Erin, thank you for being with us. And what I want to put to you is one of the themes of Break the Bias of this day is a world that is diverse, equitable and inclusive. What are your thoughts about those ambitions?
Thank you so much, Philippa. I would say I think those are all incredible ambitions, and all of us are here because I think we have some hope that working toward those ambitions is going to make the world a better place. It's a necessary challenge to be working toward a more equitable and inclusive world. Frankly, we all know already that the world itself is diverse, but it's our institutions and our centers of power that don't reflect that diversity. We're also talking about this digital freedom as well as break the bias. And digital technologies have been an incredible tool for creating greater access to education, to economic opportunities, to information generally. And that democratization of access is a key building block of a world that is more equitable and inclusive, and one that then inherently values diversity. But at the same time, we see that technology can increase equity and inclusion. It is also, recreating some of the worst parts of the offline world. It's not an equitable world now. It's not an inclusive world in all spaces, either by default sometimes or by design. And examples of that are like the horrific abuse that Mariana has described, which greatly impacts not only women's online experiences, but also their offline safety and their willingness to participate in public life, which means that we lose those voices if we are not providing safe spaces in which they can connect and share their experiences. So I'm so happy to hear from Mariana that just talking about this and the conversation is actually starting to create more of that safety for women who experience these horrific things online. But some of the other ways that we see digital inequity are, in the fact that people who generally lack access to economic resources have their social exclusion compounded by their lack of access to technology through either appropriate devices or access to data or the skills to use those things. And we know that the digital divide exists within every country, between genders and between developed countries and connected countries and those where most of the population still remains offline. And we've also seen, through the pandemic that even where technology doesn't necessarily exacerbate social problems, it can't fix everything. We've lost many of the gains of women entering the workforce over the past decades, just in the last 2 to 3 years, because being able to work from home or work online is not something that every woman can do. And even women who can, that doesn't solve the problems of childcare and of caring responsibilities that many face. So, there's a lot of work to do toward a more inclusive and equitable world. There's so many challenges, but I think technologies are also giving us more and more possibilities for creating alternative ways of working and living and thinking that are inherently more inclusive and equitable, not just for women, but for everyone.
Erin, I want to pick up one of the points you made. It really struck me when you talked about how inequalities in society are amplified online, by the gap in access and the fact that some get more abuse, more pushback than others. Given the leadership roles that you've played, what would you say about what's the best way to create effective partnership with grassroots organisations if you're trying to tackle these sort of issues?
Absolutely. I think in tackling any issue, frankly, not just these issues, but any issue which is affecting a group of people disproportionately, the most important thing that you can do is to create the structures that make it possible to hear from that group of people about the struggles that they're facing, to ensure that they have a place to share those struggles safely and where they will be heard and taken seriously. This is really the way that the foundation endeavors to do its work with communities, is to put their specific experiences front and center and to make sure that they're leading the conversation while we are looking for and providing resources that can help to remove barriers or to increase access or to help them address problems that they specifically identify in ways that are culturally sensitive and locally relevant to what they're seeing in their life, frankly.
What gives you hope?
You know, what gives me hope is really young people, and I would include Danola in that, as she's one of my colleagues in her capacity as a member of the Youth Leadership Board. But we also have been working with young people in many of our programs within the foundation over the last year, and what I see is just a tremendous amount of energy. I know, especially, anecdotally and in speaking with our partners, that young women and girls around the world really feel like they have the capacity to make change in their communities and across the world. And there are so many young people who are working toward that, who are not necessarily asking for permission, who from institutions which exist around them, but who are deploying technologies in creative ways, making connections with one another, and speaking out about the things that they care about. And that gives me an immense amount of hope.
Thank you very much. We have two more brilliant women to introduce you to, and do keep your questions coming in to this event. We're going to talk now to Anna George, who's an academic researcher at the Oxford Internet Institute. That's a part of Oxford University. Welcome, Anna. And I want to ask what you make of the next call to action on International Women's Day, a world where difference is valued and celebrated.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. It is, of course, a great call and something we should all be striving for. Having diverse perspectives has been shown to lead to better outcomes in many areas, from business to sports. And just as Vita said earlier, in the tech world, it's important so that our technology doesn't learn the biases that exist in the world. As a woman in STEM, I'm aware that we are vastly underrepresented. And Chris talked a bit about trying to increase diversity and what we need to do to make sure diversity is valued and celebrated. I think in society, we've learned that we don't need individuals to change to match structures. We need structures to change to match individuals. For example, we used to treat people with impairments as needing to change to adapt to society, but we now realize that people with impairments are disabled by barriers in society and not inherently by their different abilities. The same can be applied to women. We shouldn't put the onus on women to overcome additional obstacles that we face. We need to change society to reduce these obstacles towards women. And I think the call for a world where difference is valued and celebrated highlights the need for structures to change to match individuals.
Anna, I'm really interested in the way you started there, because you're making the point that breaking the bias is not only morally right, but economically the smart thing to do.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that there are many behaviors that challenge this. And I think some that we've talked about is we're aware that technology is not objective. Instead, humans are a part of the design, and the way humans design technology affects the way it functions. So technology, as we said, learns the bias of humans in society, and Erin spoke on this a bit. Another example is, in addition, machine learning language classifiers. They learn to associate words such as doctor more closely with men or nurse more closely with women. And this happens not because someone is malicious, but because the data that the classifier was trained on is biased because of the occupation, gender inequality present in our society. We also know that technology that isn't trained on diverse samples also learns new biases. So a common example of this is that facial recognition doesn't always recognize darker faces. And not only is there these accidental biases, but there are spaces where diversity isn't valued and it's intentional. So not everyone wants to make a more diverse world. I study extremist individuals who are opposed to diversity. They don't want these diverse voices to be heard or have power. And I don't want to repeat too much of what Mariana said about her own experience, but we know at times these extremists target individuals because of their diversity, such as being a woman in a leadership role.
So our online architecture can be designed to devalue, whether consciously or unconsciously, right? So this is a rather big question, I apologize. How do you tackle that? How do you counter that?
Yeah, it's not an easy question, and I think it's one that many of us are struggling with. So, to create a world where difference is valued and celebrated, there needs to be some change. And I've spoke just then on two issues, the way technology is designed and on harmful internet users. So, a solution for technology would be to make sure tech is created on diverse data sets and incorporates diverse perspectives in the process of creating that technology. On the internet, we need to empower victims of abuse and have clear protections in place and clear procedures of how abuse is handled when it does occur. We need to make sure that the abusers are held accountable for their actions. So these are some examples, but I will say that there's multiple approaches to tackling these problems, and a single intervention won't work. Different types of behaviors require different interventions. And I think as we continue with this panel, I'm sure we'll hear more solutions being offered.
Yeah, I hope so too. Anna, I want to ask, can you think of an example of anywhere where, devaluing by design has been pointed out and perhaps something has been done about it? Do you think awareness is growing?
So I do think awareness is growing, and I think on this panel we've had some examples, and I know that there's a great Netflix documentary that showed that the way that facial recognition technology was designed was on a not diverse data set. So it was mostly shown on white male faces, so then it had a hard time recognizing darker female faces. And once technology firms were made aware, there started to be some pushback, and we as a society started to hold them accountable for this. And hopefully that means that technology companies in the future will want to include more diverse data sets, because we'll hold them accountable if they don't.
Thank you. I think back to Erin saying that what gives her hope is young people not waiting to be asked, but speaking out when they see these kind of biases and devaluing by design. That's a phrase that I'm definitely going to take away from today. Keep sending us your thoughts. We've got some interesting thoughts emerging already from our brilliant speakers. Let me finally welcome Dita Formankova, who's the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Avast and founder of Chiquitas. And Dita, I want to ask you how you rally women within organizations to come together in that cause of women's equality.
Well, first, thank you very much for having me here today, representing all diversity and inclusion champions and allies in Avast. It's a really great honor, and it's a very powerful debate. So thank you very much all. Well, as said many times, we are all aiming at an equitable and inclusive environment where all talents are heard and valued, and they have the same access, as Janola said too. And we can actually open this conversation with saying that only then, when we achieve the representation of minorities within the teams, we can benefit from the diversity. So building innovative products that allow everyone the best customer experience and build more innovative, resilient teams. So I would say, in general, like to encourage women's equality in the workplace. I would in general mention 4 things, like diversification of candidate talent pools, then addressing systemic biases, then also gender pay gap, eliminating a gender pay gap, and also ensuring leadership accountability. But also gathering women or representatives of underrepresented groups on one place and ensuring a safe environment where they can actually raise their concerns is actually great initiative. So I would definitely encourage all companies to establish employee resource groups, as Vitya is representing here today too.
I would say that in my life as a news journalist, it's not just questions of bias are not just in how you treat the stories, but deciding which stories to put on the agenda. And what you've just said really resonated with me. Dita, I want to ask you, from what you've been hearing from your fellow panelists, is there anything that's particularly struck you?
Oh, it was actually many great things that we heard today. 2 things I would definitely point out is that we need to ensure equitable access to the technology in order to achieve equitable world. And then I really love the saying that we need to change structures to fit individuals. So as I said, like to address the women equality in the workplace, we need to treat systemic biases because our individual biases against minorities influence our decisions, and we should definitely be aware of them. But most importantly, we should be responsible for addressing stereotypes and biases in the processes, preventing underrepresented talent from engaging, growing, to equally experiencing the company culture and culture in general. So in companies, we should definitely get rid of job description referring male and young candidates, and also getting rid of talent pools lacking in women and ethnic minorities too. So we should definitely re-evaluate our referral programs, performance criteria, and development opportunities, because they are constantly deepening our systemic bias.
Thank you so much. I'm going to bring back in your fellow panelists now. We already have quite a few questions coming in, and I want to be able to get this interaction going between those who are tuned into our debate and hear from you. One of the first questions, I might put this to you first, Erin, but I will also watch to see if you wave at me on screen. Shane asks, despite their best intentions, many tech companies struggle to recruit women into engineering and technical roles. What more can companies do to address this?
You're putting this one to me and not Dita. I might have to ask her to weigh in on this as well. But
fine, that's fine.
I think
Dita first.
No worries.
I'm looking at you on screen. Just this idea, which it's not new, is it? But it's still present. This the need to recruit, to get this talent pool to be much more diverse.
Absolutely. I think that there are things that the company can do internally to ensure that it is creating a culture that actually keeps women and that elevates women into leadership roles and helps them grow their careers. So it's one thing to be able to bring in women and to recruit from a wider talent pool, but it's another thing to create a culture of belonging and a culture and a workplace where women want to stay and grow their careers. And then as you attract more women into new roles, you are able to continue to increase the number of women in your workforce. So I think addressing the company culture, and that includes accountability of leadership, that includes awareness of the entire staff, that includes a constant desire to look at and improve processes, working from the inside out is one of the most important things that companies can do actually to attract talent, because women are savvy and are interested in working in places not just where they're going to be a number walking in the door, but where they're actually going to be able to grow and contribute as a whole person. And I think it's really important that companies recognize that from the get-go.
That puts me in mind, Anna, of something you said about working in the STEM subjects. You're at Oxford University. It's not just a matter of getting you there in the first place, but making you feel you belong and keeping you.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not enough to put out a call for women to join tech. It needs to become a space where we can actually be part of technology and be valued in this industry. So one thing personally that was a challenge for me is the financial ability to study what I do and to become part of the technology field. So I'm relying on scholarships such as the support from Avast to become a woman in tech. And I'm glad that companies such as Avast are realizing that they do need to support women in these roles.
Yeah, and actually I think it was Dita, you mentioned gender equality in pay. I mean, the most fundamental thing, if we're going to feel appreciated and decide to stay and put our energies into any one role.
Yeah, sure. I think, I totally agree with what Erin and said. It starts and ends with inclusion. Diversity is easy, but then, it's really important that all diverse voices are heard and valued. And so how to ensure diverse candidate pools is also, we need to ensure that we eliminate the gender pay gap, because even though in general women's labor force participation has grown significantly globally, and women are working generally longer hours and pursuing higher education, despite this progress, significant wage gaps between men and women persist. So we can only achieve an inclusive environment if we offer equitable pay for all employees with the same experience and roles.
Move on to another question, because they're starting to come in faster now. To Danola first, but I'll get a few points of view on this. Radka asks, how can women feel more confident if they're working in a male-dominated company? What actions can the company make for equality and breaking down gender bias? And Danola, I don't know whether this is something that feels very personal to you, or just your thoughts on that big challenge.
No, thank you so much for that question. So I can definitely identify with this question, because I started off my career after I graduated in investment banking, which is a very male-dominated field. And I think it just basically comes down to personally, I think confidence comes from when you feel like you can be your true self, the whole of your true self somewhere. And I personally feel the least confident in situations or in places where I feel like I'm not able to bring my full self or be my full self without any sort of judgment or marginalization and so on. So that's where I think it comes upon the organization to basically go beyond the diversity to the inclusion piece. Someone said something that just stuck with me a few years ago when I went to an event, and they said it's one thing to basically invite someone to a party, but it's another thing to go up to them to invite them up to dance. And I can't think of a better way to basically explain it, where you just want, you can feel when you something is just done just to be like, oh, we're diverse, or to tick a box. And then when you actually feel welcome in the place and actually part of the community and part of the fabric of the community. And I think the onus really, especially when we're talking about a workplace where people are given their time, their, expertise, energy, the onus to me really is on the organization to really take that extra step and the extra measures to try to go beyond the diversity into the inclusion piece, so people can feel like they're bringing their entire selves into work and they can be their truer selves, because that's where I think true confidence can really come from, and also true talent and contribution to the organization can come from.
Let me take that straight to Mariana, because Mariana, I know, well, you're in your 20s, you're very young to be having packed so much into your career already. And I wonder whether you feel, to pick up the metaphor, you've been welcomed to the party or even allowed to get up and dance.
That's a very good metaphor. Yes, I think one of the best things about my job, and actually it comes back to the Panorama investigation I spoke about, but has been the editors here at the BBC who not just support my reporting more broadly and the topics I cover, but investigations like that Panorama. And in this case, I'm a female editor, Karen Whiteman, who absolutely kind of recognised how important it was to investigate it and to tell that story, but also editors who support me in the online hate I receive, and they listen and they understand and they realise it's not normal and they want to change it and they want to make sure that I feel safe and they want to make sure I'm able to do my job. And so I think that's the being invited to dance, that having supportive, in my case, editors, but I guess bosses in general who understand the different obstacles you might face personally, but also really kind of back you up and are very engaged with what you're doing. I mean, particularly when it comes to the online hate, I've been very, very grateful for that. And to be able to investigate these kinds of stories and to tell them and to speak to the women impacted and for people to realise how important it is, that feels like real progress, and just a vital part of what I and many other journalists do.
I've got a quote that's been sent in here from Mike, and I'm just going to ask whoever wants to jump in first. I'll create chaos here. Ask for you to volunteer answers. But let me give you the quote. Mike says, in James Damore's well-publicised memo from his time at Google, he said, on average, women have a greater interest in people relative to men, and making technical roles like programming more collaborative and people-oriented might help encourage women to take up such roles in organisations. Any thoughts on this? I'm kind of going to ask you to wave at the screen, or I'm going to, because you're all too polite to jump in on top of each other, going to ask Erin to speak. Just that thought
Sure.
of changing the nature of the role might be what's needed.
I would say that without speaking to that whole document, which has its own kind of controversial history, I would point to what Anna said about the need to really think about how structures are best fit to individuals and not always asking individuals to change to fit structures. And so I think that there, in a lot of workforces, technical or otherwise, the structures have been created to fit a certain type of person, and historically that person has been male, and oftentimes that person has been white, and we know that not everyone fits into structures that have been created for one particular mold, right? So absolutely, I think there's a need for organizations, for companies to think about how they are structuring work in order to be more open to people who come from all sorts of diverse backgrounds and who have all sorts of different traits, to be able to help them become more productive in the way that the company or the organization needs them to be. That goes not just for women, but that can be around women's preferences, as this quote alludes to, or the roles that they play in the rest of their lives because of certain societal structures, as carers, as mothers, right? But it also speaks to neurodivergence. It speaks to disability and ability, which people have in varying measures depending on the environments that they're in. So I think absolutely changing the nature of work will always have an impact on who is able to do that work and how well they're able to perform it.
George at the Oxford Internet Institute, can I pick up with you? Because part of what we're doing is it's talking about people's personal experiences and the things we can see before us and call out. But what you were bringing to the debate earlier was perhaps we also need to step back and look at the way things are designed. And what more can we do in order to notice what assumptions are being made?
Yeah, so I think we need to challenge these organizations' expectations and saying things like, on average, women do this and men do this. So without getting too scientific, but usually when we study the average of any population, such as women versus men, we're saying like, okay, 50%, the average is in the middle, right? So there's still women that are do prefer more independent than collaborative structures. So I liked what Erin was saying, is focusing the job more on the individual instead of placing people into a box and saying like, oh, you're a woman, you should want to have a job that's more collaborative. We've seen how this goes wrong. So one research study showed that in academia, it tends to be that women are expected to take care of the in-house structures of the department, and then that frees up men to go out and make external collaborations. So there's these biases that come in when we start to say that on average women are like this and we need to change their roles to be like this. Instead, we need to match the individual with the job and make sure that structures are inclusive of different types of individuals.
Oh, Anna, that makes me think all the way back to the idea of men as the hunter-gatherers who go out whilst the women tend the campfires. And sometimes you think, how much progress have we made? But I'm glad that we're bringing up all these ideas and assumptions into the debate. Something that I think a few of our audience are interested in is, how can you stop the assumptions developing? Let me bring you Marina's question. She says, what can we do to fight bias starting at a young age? How can we educate our children to not even start developing gender bias? I mean, there are some obvious things, aren't there? We've had so many debates about children's toys, for example, but beyond that, Danola, I want to ask you first your thoughts on this about.
Yes, no, so
the assumptions and the kind of culture that we're surrounding our children with.
Yes, no, thank you so much for that question. And I'll answer it by kind of referring to what I was thinking about when my colleagues there were answering the previous question. So I'm not a fan in general of ascribing personality types to gender, because I think that just creates such an unfair and unrealistic expectations of people, and it doesn't really celebrate other traits that don't necessarily fit into the expectation. And I think that's then would be my advice when it comes to kind of dealing with young people. Society is the way it is because of people. We make up society and community, and our behaviors, no matter how small, contributes to what the status quo is. So that comes with responsibility. Whenever you have the opportunity to be around young people and so on, whatever impression that you give, or things that you say or things that you do, will leave an impression, and that contributes to society, and that contributes to that person's lived experience. That's heavy, but it's important for us all to understand that. And then that way we just think, what am I doing? And yes, it takes kind of doing this internal work and constantly reevaluating yourself to think, what am I doing that is either contributing or not contributing to, gender equality or gender inequality? And what something we have to all recognize is, if you're not doing anything to necessarily counteract the way society is, which is currently quite patriarchal, then that means you're actually kind of part of the problem. So being passive and being oh, well, I'm not going to, talk about it, or not really going to push one way or another, you're actually pushing on the side of the status quo already. So if anyone is serious about actually thinking, I don't want to contribute to gender inequality, then you actually need to then take active steps in just the way you communicate with young people in your life, with your friends, with your family, with the kind of language that you use, and also being open to the fact that you might make mistakes, but always being so open to kind of correcting yourself, being corrected, and just learning as you go along. I think that's the best way as an individual you can contribute to not, contributing to the problem, basically not contribute to the problem.
Thank you, and I like the kind of humility as well in the way in which you bring this, but it's a very powerful insight there. I'm starting to think, am I going to get through all these questions? I'm going to bring just a few more before I give you each a chance to kind of sum up what this debate has meant to you. Can I put to actually Dieter, I wonder whether you would speak to this from Belgrano. She says, do you think social media has helped women be more heard?
Yeah, I think so. They had an opportunity to have another voice, but at the same time, social media are quite intimidating sometimes too. So it's definitely a tool, but not a solution.
Mariana, your thoughts on that? Do you think social media has helped women be more heard? And is that necessarily a good thing? I think we might just have, Mariana might just have dropped off there, but I'm going to move on to, I need to get your questions in here. Elnaz has asked this. What are the consequences of positive discrimination, like having quotas for women in tech roles? Do you think it helps or hurts women? Who to ask about this? I'm going to come back to you.
Sorry, you cut out there.
The positive discrimination question, does it help or hurt, say, women in tech roles? And going first to Danola.
Yes, so I'll just say that in general, one of the key problems is if you start to treat people like that. And I truly believe that people can feel, how you treat them and the way you look at them. The last thing you want is for someone to feel like they're only there because they had to have a woman there, or they had to have a Black person there, or they had to have, XYZ marginalized group there. And I think that's one of the key dangers. And when people feel like, okay, I'm only recruiting this person for that reason, whether you do it on purpose or not, you start to treat them as the one that we had to get in because we had to get this, So I think it really, again, comes down to sort of how people kind of, some things in theory are good. Okay, let's do this to make sure that, we have, but then when people internalize that and start to treat people in that way, as that number, as opposed to the person that they are, or, according to their gifts and talents, then that's where we start to have, more serious issues.
Something else on positive discrimination in a way. Barbara asks, how do you think a company can start creating a gender balanced workforce? What are the first steps to take? I might add, do you think that it's a good idea to create a gender-balanced workforce? And I'm going to give that hot potato to Erin. Might be off.
It was. I thought it was going to save me from the hot potato, but I guess not. Thank you very much for that question. There are a number of things which an organization needs to start with, and actually Dita and I have some experience and have had a lot of conversations about this. I think the first thing that an organization needs to do is start from where it is right now, take stock of the data that it has on its own practices, on its own people, on its own recruitment, on retention, and to really try to understand what are the contributing factors to what its workforce looks like at that moment. I think we also, gender balanced or 50-50 gets thrown around sometimes, and I think it's a bit of a red herring, because sometimes it's simply not possible to create a gender balanced workforce because you really don't necessarily have equal talent, because the talent pool just isn't what you would like it to be able to create an equal workforce, for instance, in particular areas of tech. And so it's important to be realistic as an organization about what you can do and not set a goal or something that's just completely unrealistic, and therefore you're setting yourself up to fail. So I think it's taking stock of where you are and determining what you can change, and then really taking systemic steps to ensure that you are actually moving down that path and not just giving lip service to something because it's within the cultural conversation and feels necessary.
Well, I like that in this debate we haven't been giving lip service, I hope. I think we've been very open and pretty realistic about challenges. We've also heard about solutions. I'm going to just briefly ask what you're taking away from this. Erin, since I have you, just a thought about what you'll take away or what you might want to tell other people from what you've heard today.
I think that, one thing that I take away from this and from listening to all of my colleagues here on this call is that we're not a monolith. We all have different experiences. We all bring different ideas to the table about these problems, which do impact us all by different ways. I would also say, I think considering the intersectionality of all of our identities is another really important thing in this discussion about breaking the bias. We don't just necessarily face biases about who we are as women, but also based on our age, our nationality, our race, our sexuality, and all of those things compound potentially to leave individuals with fewer opportunities. And, it's up to all of us to make changes within the sphere of influence that we have. And it's up to us to include different perspectives, to learn from other people, and to figure out how we can apply that to create a better situation for ourselves, for our colleagues, and for everyone around the world. And I think everyone here is really working within their own sphere to do that. And I take away a lot of hope and optimism from that.
Let's go to the academic sphere now. I want to bring Anna back in. Anna, you've talked to us with I see your personal feelings, but you are so across the research on discrimination, on inequality, on what it takes to create a truly equitable world. And I wonder what has struck you most about the discussion we've had.
Yeah, I think one theme that occurred, especially here at the end, is we need to stop saying women are best at this and men are best at this, and instead we should value each individual for their abilities and make sure structures support those abilities. I'm not sure if I was clear earlier with the academia example, but what I was trying to say is we need to stop creating these boxes in general and not put women into a box, but instead support them for who they are as individuals, and that starts from a young age.
Yeah, I apologise for having you all in boxes rather than having you in the room with me. But we know that in spirit, we are all together having this conversation. Dita, can I ask for what you will take away from today?
I'm actually leaving the debate with hope and optimism, as Erin said too. One topic that would summarize what I'm actually taking away from this discussion was it's important to be able to change structures so all individuals can shine and grow, but at the same time we can all actually be participating in creating inclusive environment with our daily actions and decisions.
Now I'm going to give you the last word. I love this idea of so all women can shine. What are you taking away?
My takeaway is that there is good out there. You know, we've spoken about gender bias today. We have people listening in and asking questions. That's a sign that the good guys, the good people exist out there and they're active. There is appetite for equity, for equality, and it's even growing within communities. And there are people working on this on a governmental level, on a corporate level, in academia, and I think this brings hope. The future is definitely bright and positive if we just, you know, don't relent and we just keep doing our bit to contribute and push the conversation forward.
Great note to end on. Danola, Anna, Dita, Erin, thank you. Mariana had to leave early. That is the nature of the news business. But she brought such power to our panel as well. That is all now for our Avast Foundation International Women's Day special. Thank you also for joining us and for some of the great questions that have come in. We have felt the presence of the audience with us. And do follow the social channels for the Avast Foundation for more on this discussion. But my thanks to you all. Goodbye from all of us.